Folks, welcome to my virtual lakeside whirlwind tour of my research. My name is Robert Prentky. I am a forensic psychologist, and I've been a forensic examiner for about 40 years now. Almost all of my research over the past 40 years has, in one way or another, somehow involved sex offenders. I have prepared something of a PowerPoint that illustrates for you in just 4 slides what 4 major grant projects have looked like, and I'll just very briefly describe them to you. The first and most recent involves juvenile sex offenders, something that probably is more dear to my heart than most of the other areas of research that I've done. It attempts to shift the juvenile court to a more rehabilitative focus than has been evident over the past half century, when the court used to be concerned, have what was called a parens patriae interest in children, rehabilitation, remediation, and that course has been lost to a much more criminalized mission for the juvenile court. So we created something called the Youth Needs Progress Scale, which moves us away from a focal risk assessment to a remediation of risk and related needs, meaning that the focus should be on those interventions and treatment needs necessary to remediate risk. And that is a project that went on for about 3 years. It was programmed, that is the scale we developed, was programmed in REDCap, was cited in 5 states, and we gathered data for a year. And one of our dissertation students, doctoral students, Amanda, is doing her dissertation on those data, looking at taxonomic differences in juvenile sex offenders. That actually, that grant went from 2016 to 2019, so it is only a year old. The next very large, rather cumbersome grant started in 2014. It was the very last year President Obama's term in office. It was intended to develop treatment interventions for students found responsible for campus sexual misconduct. College students that have been victimized by sexual misconduct. The treatment interventions, of course, were on those found responsible for those victimizations. At the end, after 4 years, we did develop 2 very, very large treatment interventions, one a standard CBT approach, cognitive behavior therapy, and the other more psychoeducational that we called AP, or advanced psychoeducation. But the interest for students actually has been on questionnaires that we administered to some 2,000 college students at 14 universities. Roughly half were women, roughly half were men. And what we yielded was an enormous trove of data, of information, more diverse than had ever been gathered on college students before, and has interested many investigators that we've shared our data with, including, of course, many of our students. There are 2 doctoral students that are doing their dissertations on these data at present. Megan, looking at reasons for not reporting campus sexual misconduct, and the other, Allie, who just finished her dissertation on attachment and campus sexual misconduct, mediating roles of psychopathy and empathy. The third grant project that has attracted a lot of interest from students. Um, involves child pornography, but it actually involves a lot more than just that. It was called a multi-pronged approach to strengthening internet child safety. It was supported by OJJDP, and it involves four subsamples. We looked at middle school students, some 2,000 high school students, about 11 to 1,200 college students, and two samples of offenders. Internet sex offenders only, that is, there was no evidence that they'd ever committed a battery, a sexual battery, and a second group of child molesters who, of course, by definition, had committed a sexual battery, but there was no indication that they'd ever used child pornography. Sarah is doing her dissertation on those data entitled Uncovering the Diversity of Offenders with Explicit Children, exploitative children online, a comprehensive comparison of child pornography offenders. And finally, the last grant-funded project, a little more complicated. It dates back to a law referred to as ASAP in the state of Massachusetts, Assessment for Safe and Appropriate Placement, and it involves just children who were flagged by Child and Youth Services as being at high risk, and pursuant to something called the Rosenberg Law, which established this ASAP evaluation, these children were to be identified and so evaluated by this ASAP procedure. The Department of Child and Youth Services had requested that I come in and do a research project, essentially looking at the efficacy of the law. In other words, was it actually accomplishing what the founders of the law intended for it to do? We once again gathered a very large team through Justice Resource Institute in Boston. And we went around to all the sites, the DCF sites in Massachusetts, and gathered a sample of 866 children. That's 866 out of the approximately 1,500 children that had been ASAP flagged at that point. The initial intake data relying solely on the files of DCF, which were exhaustive, yielded 213 variables. These 213 variables were coded, 20% of them double coded for reliability on all 866 kids. We were then supported by the National Institute of Justice to do a 7-year follow-up of those children, and another 88 variables were coded on that follow-up study. All in all, it has yielded an enormous amount of data, and once again attracted a lot of students, some of whom have published studies from those data, including Laura, who's long since graduated. She did a study on sexual reoffense trajectories with youths in the child welfare system. And another study by Ali, the same Ali I referred to earlier, who did a study on retrospective study of fire setting with boys in the child welfare system. And as I said, both of those studies were published. That's about all for my whirlwind tour. If you have any questions or thoughts or comments, please feel free to be in touch. Take care. Bye-bye.